And the authority of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
As far as the Sunnah is concerned, it is the second unavoidable source of Islam. If you have to understand Islam, number one source is the Quran, and the second is the Sunnah of the Prophet. To understand the full Islam, you cannot understand without these two sources. Both are important, the Quran as well as authentic Hadith, the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet. And
Islam claims that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet, that the Quran, God's revelation to mankind, was sent down to Muhammad, and the Quran is the final revelation for all mankind, and that the Quran and the Sunnah is man's example to follow. So they say Islam is basically the only true religion and the final religion for all of mankind. What does the Sunnah mean? Well, the Sunnah is simply the way that Muhammad lived and the pattern of life that all people should follow. Now, there are four genres of the Sunnah. We have the Sirah, which is the biographies of Muhammad. We have the Hadiths, which are the sayings of Muhammad. We have the Tafsirs, who are the commentaries to the Quran. And we have the Tariq, which is the histories of Muhammad. And all four of these genres are part of the canon, so to speak, of authoritative literature that Muslims are to follow. Now let's let Zaria Naik tell us the importance of the Sunnah and the Hadiths.
Brother asked a question that there are some people who are Muslim but they don't accept Hadith. A Muslim cannot be a Muslim if he doesn't accept Hadith. You can call them pseudo-Muslims.
the word Sunnah literally means the way or the custom, and the Sunnah of the Prophet means the way of the Prophet or the Prophet's tradition. The word Sunnah, it indicates and means the sayings, the deeds and the approval of the Prophet in the span of 23 years during his prophethood. It means what the Prophet said, what the Prophet did, and what the Prophet approved in the span of 23 years during his prophethood. And the Sunnah of the Prophet can be divided into three types. The first is Sunnat-e Qawli, that means the sayings of the Prophet. The second is Sunnat-e Faili, that means the actions of the Prophet. And the third is Sunnat-e Takriri, which means the approval of the Prophet. So basically, these three types of Sunnah are there in three different categories.
Okay, that seems very straightforward. But could you perhaps, for the benefit of the viewers and myself, cite some examples of each of the different categories you've mentioned?
The example of the first type of Sunnah, that's Sunnat-e Qawli, the sayings of the Prophet.
Now with that in mind, here is the classical account, the standard Islamic narrative about Muhammad and the Sunnah. 570, we have Muhammad's birth. 610, he meets Jibril in the cave at Hira. Then from 610 to 622, we have the Meccan revelations. 621, we have the Mirage to the seven heavens. 622, we have the Hijrah from Mecca to Medina. In 622 to 632, we have the Medinan revelations. Then we have the conquering of Mecca in 630. Then 632, we have Muhammad's death by poisoning probably. Then we have the first caliph after Muhammad, Abu Bakr. Then we have Umar. Then we have Uthman. And then we have Ali. And that is the standard Islamic narrative. Now I'm going to put those dates and events on a timeline so you can better comprehend the standard Islamic narrative. And the conclusion of all this is Islam was fully formed in the Hijaz, that's Mecca and Medina, by 661 AD. This is according to Islam and their own sources. So here we have Muhammad born in 570. Then we have the Quran is first revealed to him in a cave in Hira, where he is praying by himself, and the angel Gabriel squeezes him, grabs him, whatever he does, he tells him to recite 3 times, and he starts to receive revelation. Then in 621 we have the Mirage, where Muhammad flew on a winged horse from the Hijaz to Jerusalem, and he went to the 7th heavens and talked to a very dead Moses and got the five prayers for all Muslims to follow today. Then we have the Hijra, which is the move to Medina. Then we have Muhammad taking over Mecca in 630. Then we have the death of Muhammad at 632, probably by poisoning from a Jewish girl who had just had her family slaughtered by Muhammad. So let's go to Abu Bakr, became the first caliph. Now he was the first one to write the Quran down. Then we have Umar, and he expands the borders of the caliphate from North Africa around Tripoli all the way to the west to Persia in the east. Then we have Uthman. He was the caliph that burned all of the variant Qurans that didn't match the copy that he found under the bed of one of Muhammad's wives. And this Quran became the official Quran that is written. And then we have Ali. This is Muhammad's son-in-law. He's the 4th rightly guided caliph. Now, where does all of this information come from? The standard Islamic narrative timeline is pretty simple. Muhammad was born in 570. He dies in 632. The Quran is compiled in 652. Then we have Islam is fully formed and is the golden age of the rightly guided caliphates, and that ends in 661. So we have Muhammad born in 570, dies 632, and the completion of the Sunnah, everything, the Quran, the Sunnah, everything about Islam is completed in 661. But where do we learn all of this information? When do we learn of all this material on this timeline? Was this information written down by eyewitnesses? Now that would be great. If all of this information was written down by eyewitnesses, you would have great evidence. Or if all of this information was written down by people who got all of this information from the eyewitnesses, even that would be excellent evidence. Now keep in mind the totality of the genres of the Sunnah or the Sirah. That's the histories. We have the Hadiths, that's the saying, the Tafsirs, there are commentaries, and we have the Tariq, which are the histories. Now let's take a look at where this information comes from and when it was written down. Okay, here we have a standard Islamic narrative timeline, and we're going to go by these dates where Muhammad died and when the information about Muhammad was actually written down. So we have the first biography of Muhammad written by Ibn Ishaq in 765. That's 133 years after the death of Muhammad. But we can't go by Ibn Ishaq. Why? Because we don't have any of his actual writings. This guy here tells us about Ibn Ishaq, and his name is Ibn Hisham, and he writes his biography in 833. That's 201 years after the death of Muhammad. His biography is finally written down. Now we're going to take a look at the Hadiths, which Zaria Naik says you cannot be a Muslim without following the Hadiths. So where did these Hadiths come from? Who wrote them down? When did they write them down? Maybe whoever wrote the Hadiths knew Muhammad. Maybe they were eyewitnesses to Muhammad. Maybe they were people who got the information from Muhammad. Were these Hadith writers even living in the same century as Muhammad? Let's find out. And here's the standard Islamic narrative timeline. Muhammad dies in 632, and the first hadith is written by Bukhari. Al-Bukhari in 870. That's 238 years after the death of Muhammad. And we have the final hadith written by An-Nisa in 915. This is 283 years after the death of Muhammad. Well, maybe the commentaries on the Quran and the histories of Muhammad are better evidence than what we've seen. Let's take a look. The Tafsirs and the Tariq, the commentary and the histories written by Al-Tabari in 923. Muhammad dies in 632. As you can see, that's 291 years after the death of Muhammad. So we have the complete standard Islamic narrative timeline here. Muhammad dies 632. All authoritative books were finally finished 923. That's almost 300 years after the death of Muhammad. This is horrible evidence. Now keep in mind how important the hadiths are. He collected 600,000 sayings of Muhammad. He got rid of 98% of them, and he got down to 7,397 hadiths. I mean, why? Well, why get rid of 98% of them? Who gave him the authority? Did he get revelation to do it? Did Allah tell him what to do? Did he just decide on his own? I mean, look at what's left in the hadiths. We have Muhammad having intercourse with children. We have Muhammad having sex slaves. We have Muhammad trading African slaves. We have Muhammad lusting after his son's wife. All of these things are left in the hadiths. What in the world got changed and thrown out of the hadiths? Were they worse than these things? And why did it take over 200 years to write down the sayings of Muhammad? None of these sayings were written down by eyewitnesses. None of these sayings were written down by people who knew the eyewitnesses, and none of them actually came within the same century of Muhammad. In fact, 2+ centuries after Muhammad. This, again, is horrible historical evidence. Where did all these guys live? Where did Al-Tabari live? Where did Bukhari live? Where did all these guys who write the histories, the tafsirs, and the hadiths, where do they live? Do they even live in Arabia? No, they do not. Listen, look at this chart. This is the Islamic traditions about everything that happened in Mecca and Medina. This is the Hijaz. But the writers of all these events live nowhere near the Hijaz itself. Ibn Hisham was from Basra. That's, 1,200 miles from Mecca. Then we have Bukhari, who lives up in Bukhara, which is 2,600 miles from the Hijaz. And we have Al-Tabari, 1,700 miles away from the Hijaz in Tabaristan. All of these guys didn't even live in the same vicinity of the events. Again, that's horrible historical evidence for a truth claim. Now we're going to look at the New Testament timeline using the same genres that the Sunnah uses. We're going to use the Hadith, the sayings of Jesus, the Sirah, the biographies of Jesus. Those are all found in the Gospels. We have the Tafsirs, that's the Paul's letters apply Jesus' teaching. That's commentaries on his teaching. Then we have the history, which is in Acts. And we have Jesus' death at 33 AD. Now, a lot of scholars, especially preterist scholars, will date the entire New Testament written before 70 AD. One of these people is Daniel Wallace, probably the most respected Greek textual critic in the world today, says that the entire New Testament was written before 70 AD. Let's take a look at that chart. That's 37 years. 37 years, according to these scholars, for the complete Hadith the complete Sirah, the complete Tafsir, and the Tariq histories, all complete within 37 years, compared to Islam. Almost 300 years, all of their authoritative books were finished. Now we're going to use the most liberal dates that you can have for the writing of the New Testament, and we're going to look at them a little closer. Let's first look at the histories. That's the Tariq. That's the book of Acts. So we have Jesus' death at 33, and Acts was written at 52 to 62. That's 20 to 30 years after the death of Jesus, versus 291 years for the same thing with Islam. Okay, let's look at the Tafsir, the commentaries. That's Paul's letters. Then we see the Tafsirs, the commentaries written in Paul's letters between 48 and 65 AD, Jesus' death 33 AD. That's 15 to 32 years after the death of Jesus, compared to almost 300 years according to Islam. There we see the histories written by Al-Tabari 291 years after. That's almost 300 years. Now we're going to look at the Hadiths and the Sirah. This is the sayings and the biography of Jesus. And these can be found in the Gospels. Now keep in mind, these are the liberal dates. So we have all of this information, the Sirah and the biography in the Gospels. And let's go to Matthew and Luke, which the liberal date there is written at 80 AD. That's 47 years after the death of Jesus. Then we have the Gospel of Mark, written around 70 AD. That's 37 years after the death of Jesus. And then we have the last Gospel written by John in 90 AD. That's 57 years after the death of Jesus. So that's 57 years for the total Hadiths, the total Sirah in the Gospels, written by 57 years. Now let's compare that to the standard Islamic narrative, 283 years for the Hadiths compared to Islam. The biographies of Muhammad were completed 203 years after the death of Muhammad, and his sayings were not written down until 283 years after the death of Muhammad. So we have the entire New Testament timeline, the Hadiths, the sayings, the Tafsir, the Tariq, all written within 57 years of the death of Jesus, compared to Muhammad, almost 300 years. There is no comparison. The New Testament destroys the standard Islamic narrative. The New Testament was written by eyewitnesses of Jesus, people who knew Jesus, who lived with Jesus, heard what he said, saw what he did. And we have information from people who got the information from eyewitnesses. That would be Luke and Mark, and we have Matthew and John. All of that information is from eyewitnesses, whether it's from the mouth of the own eyewitnesses or written down by people who got it from the eyewitnesses. And the complete New Testament was written within the lifetime of the witnesses of Jesus. And Muhammad's sayings and his biographies, the tafsirs, the history, all of it was completed almost 300 years, not even in the same century. No one knew Muhammad. No one spoke to those who knew Muhammad, who wrote all this stuff down. Islam, in its standard Islamic narrative, does not hold up to historical evidence. You cannot trust it. Now, why is this important? This is important because both Islam and the Bible talk about the most important topic in the world, and that's Jesus. And both religions have different versions of Jesus. You can't trust the Islamic Jesus because their sources are not historically reliable. But you can't trust the Bible. And the Islamic Jesus is the wrong Jesus. It says Jesus wasn't even the Son of God. It says that Jesus didn't die on a cross. It says that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And that's the complete opposite of the truth. The Bible teaches that Jesus is Lord. He became a man. He died for the sins of mankind, and he rose from the dead. He is Lord. And whoever puts their trust in Jesus and what he did for them and starts following him as their Lord, those people become Christians. And those who keep following the false prophet Muhammad will be lost. But here is your opportunity, my dear Muslim friend. This is decision day for you to leave. The historical evidence proves that the tafsirs, the commentaries, the hadiths, all that stuff comes so late. You can't trust it. And don't tell me about the chain of narration. The chain of narration wasn't even written down until after the hadiths were written down. And don't tell me everybody was illiterate. That's why nobody wrote down the sayings of Muhammad. Well, that's not true. They controlled them. The Ummah controlled major cities from Africa to Persia. And they had to collect taxes. They had to run these cities. People were able to read and write. So that's not an excuse either. The reason why they didn't get written down to almost 300 years after is because they were made up. They were completely fabricated. Maybe bits and pieces of little stories, and then they grew into legends, and that's what we have in the hadiths. So my dear Muslim friends, today is decision day. You need to leave Islam behind and trust in Jesus today. And if you do that, my dear Muslim friend, you will never regret it.